I got to have a lot of interesting experiences in my life and growing up. One of the things that I remember vividly is my freshman and sophomore years. I got to live in the Rocky Mountains, and in the wintertime, that meant a lot of skiing, and that was really awesome. Got to ski 3 days a week, all winter long. But one of the other things that I remember, and I love that, one of the things I remember is going to church. We had a tiny, tiny church. Sometimes there might be, on Wednesday nights especially, might be like 7 to 9 of us in there. Sundays, maybe a dozen to 20 or something like that, but really little group. And we had no property of our own, so we rented some room at the community center in the little town near where we lived. And the heat was not very reliable in that building. And it was often really, really cold. We would go to church with moon boots and gloves and toboggans and wear them all the way through the service. And on one particular occasion, it was 20 below zero outside, and I think it was maybe about 10 degrees above zero inside when we were gathered for worship. And one of the things that I remember is my parents expressing their concern as to whether or not the communion juice was going to freeze during the service. So I had some interesting wintertime experiences as a kid, and I loved winter. I really don't even remember ever being cold. It just never really thought about being cold. Felt like I was kind of impervious to the cold. But to be honest with you, time works its way with all of us. The older I get, the less I like winter. And I don't know that it's just the cold. The cold bothers me more than it used to, but maybe it's the short days and the way that the sun is low on the horizon, even at the middle of the day, just kind of psychologically wears you down. There's a lot of cloudiness around here in the wintertime. And so I think the accumulation of those sort of things, and one of my grandchildren the other day, we were driving down the road, and he said, "The trees are naked." There's just all of these things that you begin to notice as you get older that makes winter perhaps a little bit more depressing. And it's actually scientifically, literally harder to stay alive in the winter than it is in the summer. I looked up statistics on the CDC website, and there are 15% more deaths in America in the months of December, January, and February than there are in the months of June, July, and August. So you're 15% more likely to die in the wintertime than you are in the summertime. But the wise woman, the virtuous woman of Proverbs 31, she knew what to do about winter. We're starting a series on getting through the winter. I'll come back to that in a moment. But it says that she has no fear of winter for her household because everyone has warm clothing, is the way that it's translated in the NLT. So she could look ahead and recognize that winter was coming and knew what kind of preparations were necessary so that she could face the existential threat of the coldness of winter with fearlessness. She was prepared, and therefore the fear was greatly reduced. And because Jarrett and I love you guys, and we don't want anyone to become a victim this winter, we are beginning a new series today, a short series that'll run 4 weeks, that we're calling How to Get Through Winter. And we want to follow the example of the wise woman of Proverbs 31 and think about what preparations can we make so that we don't become a statistic, so that we don't succumb to the difficulties of winter, not necessarily even that we might die physically, but more importantly, that the ravages of winter and the effects that it has on our mood and perhaps even on our spirituality can be overcome and averted. Probably keeping physically warm is not as difficult a problem today as it was in the pre-industrial world. But it's still the most difficult season of the year in which to thrive physically, emotionally, and spiritually. So this series is going to involve 3 parts. How to get through winter. Next week, we're going to think about how we can have some purpose in the winter by being the light in the darkness. And then the week after that, we'll talk about the importance of motivating ourselves properly and fueling our motivation by keeping the fire burning. And then we'll wrap it up in 4 weeks with looking for spring, having hope for a brighter tomorrow. But today we're going to begin the series by talking about this as a key way of preparing for the winter so that we're not afraid of what lies ahead of us. We're going to embrace it together. We're going to embrace it together. In Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verses 9 through 12, the writer says, 2 are better than 1. 2 are better than 1. Because they have good return for their labor. If either of them falls down, another can help him up. But pity the one who falls and has no one to help him up. There's an old song we used to sing, there's nothing in this whole world that's as sad or as bad as being alone. And loneliness is a problem, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But the writer goes on to say, also, if 2 lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? Though one may be overpowered, 2 can defend themselves, and a cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. I love that image of the 3 strands. You know, you take one piece of string, and it's pretty easy to pull apart. You double its strength if you're trying to pull 2, and triple its strength if you pull 3. But if you take 3 pieces of string and you braid them together, it becomes like a force multiplier. It's not just 3 times harder to pull. When they're woven together in a unity of a braid, it becomes like 10 times harder to break than it would be to break 1 strand. And so there's something about the people of God coming together to form a unity that increases our strength in a powerful, powerful way. You know, the tendency in winter is to withdraw ourselves, to stay in and isolate, maybe to binge on carbs and Netflix, but this is not a good strategy, okay? Not a healthy approach to how to get through the winter. In fact, the health service company Cigna issued a report in 2018 that quantified the levels of loneliness experienced by Americans and the correlation between loneliness and other serious health problems. The report found a number of things. It found that nearly half of Americans reported feeling sometimes or always lonely. That's just a tragic statement to me. As someone who has always had other people in my life when I needed them, people that I could have meaningful and serious conversations with, that if there was something that I desperately needed to talk to someone about, I've never, ever in my life been in a situation there wasn't someone that I knew close at hand that I could talk to. But half of Americans don't feel like there's someone that they can talk to. They feel isolated and they feel lonely. 1 in 4 said they rarely or never feel that they have someone they can talk to. And social isolation, this is kind of the bottom line of their study, social isolation can be as damaging to one's health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Think about that. To become isolated, to turn inward, to cut ourselves off from the fellowship that we can enjoy in community is as deadly to us as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. That's remarkable. But we need to look to something other than isolation, Netflix, and carbohydrates as a survival technique for getting through the winter. And penguins, I got to thinking, who's really good at surviving the winter? And I couldn't think of a better example than penguins. They're pretty good at this. And did a little bit of research. Penguins can survive temperatures of down to 40 below zero and 100-mile-an-hour winds. 40 below zero, 100-mile-an-hour winds. That's cold by anybody's standards. And the way that they do this is a practice that they call collective thermoregulation. Or huddling may be a better term for it. And it says that when they gather together in these large huddles, that the penguins in the middle of the huddle require 50% less energy output to stay warm than those that are on the edge. And so you might say, well, I guess all the ones on the edge die and the ones in the middle live, but they actually have some kind of a system instinctively that they work out where they're constantly rotating from the outside edge back into the middle and then back outside again. And so together they are able to survive. For them, survival is dependent upon staying together. And you need the warmth, and I need the strength, and others need the encouragement that comes from being a part of a family of faith. There's an old preacher story about a church member years and years ago who had quit coming to church. And the preacher noticed it, and so he decided to go pay the man a visit. And when he got to his house, it was a cold winter night. And when he arrived there, the man had a roaring fire going in his fireplace. And seeing the preacher and knowing why he was there, most likely, he invited him to come in. And after their initial greetings, both of them sat down facing this fire. And the preacher didn't say a word. He just stared into the flames and studied it for a moment. And then he reached up over the fireplace and got a pair of tongs and reached into the fire and pulled out a burning, blazing, red-hot ember. And he just set it aside on the fireplace hearth alone by itself. And then continued in his silence for several minutes. And very quickly, that red-hot burning ember began to no longer burn. And then the glow and the red began to diminish until soon it was just cold and black piece of char. And still not speaking, he then picked it up and put it back in the middle of the fire, and almost instantly it began to glow red again and burst once more into flame. And with that, the preacher just got up and put on his coat and began to leave, and the man that he had come to visit came to him and said, "Preacher, thank you for that fiery sermon, and I'll see you Sunday." We recognize the importance of others and being surrounded by other people. And we need to realize that if we want to get through winter and not just survive, maybe you say, well, I'm an introvert, I can go it on my own. And maybe you will survive, but you will not thrive. You'll not get as far as God would have you to get if you continued your involvement with the people of God. I love the passage that Bryce read for us at the beginning of our service this morning. Psalm 133 says, "Behold." That word means to look intently or to stand in awe and be amazed at the thing that you see. Behold, how good and how pleasant it is when brothers dwell together in unity. That's a beautiful thing. And it goes on to use some imagery that perhaps doesn't resonate as well with us in our modern times it would with an ancient Hebrew, but it's a beautiful thing. And those are the two things that I want us to notice in the passage first, and we're just going to look at this very quickly. One is that when brethren are dwelling together in unity, it's a beautiful thing. It's a compelling thing. It's an inviting thing that other people would like to participate in. It's attractive. And not only that, we see down toward the end that it's the place, that is where God's people are dwelling together in unity. That's a place where God commands a blessing. He commands specifically the blessing of life. Some might think that he's referring simply to the city of Jerusalem or the mountains of Zion as the place where God's blessing rests, but I think rather it refers to the opening, and that is where God's people have come together in unity. That in that space, God commands a blessing of life. It's a blessing that confers wisdom. When you're participating in the people of God and you're with a unified body of believers, you receive a wisdom from the group that you do not have independent and by yourself. You receive encouragement from one another. You receive protection and healing and insight and joy and sometimes breakthrough as we strive to overcome burdens and problems that have plagued us. All of these are the kinds of things that God commands to happen among the people of God when they come together in unity. There is a powerful and beautiful blessing in the unity of God's people. But here's what that looks like in practice. In other words, Psalm 133, though he uses very concrete imagery, is still an abstract description of God's people dwelling together in unity. But what does that look like in actuality, in practice? And I think the best place to see that is in Acts chapter 2. This is where, after the 120 were in the upper room praying and waiting, God finally poured out his Spirit upon them. And the apostles went out and they began to preach the gospel, and people responded in faith. Thousands were baptized, and the church was born into the world. And then we get this amazing description in verses 42 through 47 of what that early church community looked like. It gives us a model to look to be inspired by, to try to emulate today in our modern setting, the kind of spirit that we see exemplified among this earliest group of Christians. And we see here the beauty and the commanded blessing of God resting upon the people of God. This is pretty small print. I wanted to put it all up there where you could see the whole thing at once. If you can't read that, it just means that you're like me, you're just getting old. Let's just face it. Happy birthday to you. I'm going to read it if I can. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. And every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their numbers daily those who were being saved. That's a beautiful description of the kind of community that I think all of us long for. We want to participate in something as beautiful, as compelling, as meaningful and significant, and under the blessing of heaven as this description of that early church was. And yet so often we are willing to settle for so much less. John Tyson offered a modern translation of this that explains, in his opinion, why there is so little power. And so he rephrased this passage to describe the modern American church. And it looks like this. They studied the apostles' teaching when they had time. They went to fellowship when they could fit it in. They prayed when they needed something. And they got coffee together every now and then. They had low expectations for signs and wonders in their midst. And some of the believers got together and talked about generosity, but they kept all their possessions for themselves. 2 out of 5 Sundays, they came to corporate gatherings. They didn't invite people into their homes and rarely revealed their hearts. They were largely irrelevant to all the people, and occasionally someone was randomly saved. That's a sad commentary, that someone would look at the modern American church and see that as the most apt description of it. Now, I don't think that that is a description of Lost River, but I also wonder if the Acts 2, 42 through 47 that we read a moment ago, and I'll put it back up on the screen now, is an apt description of us either. Maybe we're somewhere in between the two. And wherever we're more like the modern American version and less like the Acts 2 version, we need to stir ourselves up, pull ourselves together, and remind ourselves of the goodness of God and His blessing on us so that we can more closely approximate the spirit of this early church described for us so compellingly by the apostle or by the writer Luke. Notice about 4 things in his description, in Luke's description of this early church, this church that describes the community we all long for. First, it is a church or a gathering of people that is experiencing personal transformation as a result of practicing key spiritual disciplines. It says that they were devoting themselves to the apostles' doctrine. They were learning. It was a learning community. They were gaining in their insight and knowledge of the Lord's will and His ways. It was something that had a robust level of fellowship, of joint participation in spiritual things. They were giving themselves over to communion and to prayer. These kinds of things, inevitably, when we do them fervently and purposefully, will lead to personal change and transformation. We say over and over again here that we are a church, and our aspiration as a church is to lead people into a transforming relationship with Jesus. And these disciplines that they practiced are the key things that are necessary in order for that transformation to occur. And they were devoted to them. And I can only imagine how people were changed, how people were transformed, how people were being changed day by day, week by week, month by month, as they gave themselves to these kinds of practices within the context of a community. I can only imagine the sins that people found freedom to overcome, the generosity that we're going to see in a moment that begins to break out in people's lives, the hold that Satan had over people, those chains were broken as a consequence of their devotion to these practices. But secondly, we see that this church was one in which things were happening that could only be explained by God's intervention, by God's powerful presence manifesting itself among them. Their gatherings provoked them to awe as they were amazed by the intense and powerful presence of God among them. And so often I feel like that's an area where we need to redouble our desire, to reset our expectations, that we would come together with an anticipation that God is going to be there. God will be in our midst, that we would see, as we saw in the Revelation series, Jesus standing in the midst of His church, and there not simply to judge us, but to be there for us, to be there with us. And we should anticipate seeing people experience radical changes in their lives as a result of God's presence with us and among us. Thirdly, in the passage, we see that this community was marked by radical generosity, when it could be said that there was no needy person among them. No needy person among them, he says a few chapters later, as a result of their radical generosity. Now, this is an expression here, and it's found again in a couple of places in Acts that troubles people. It talks about them having everything in common, and it's suggested that therefore it's talking about communism. There's two dominant economic systems that have been with us for a couple of centuries, especially in the West, really throughout the world. One of them is communism. And it has, to be quite honest with you, in my opinion, been a colossal failure. In spite of whatever noble aspirations those seeking to put it into practice have had, it leaves in its wake people starving by the millions and being lowered into deeper and deeper cycles of poverty. We have, on the other hand, capitalism, which someone said is the worst economic system imaginable, except when compared to everything else we've tried. And it has perhaps, as far as an economic system is concerned, lifted more people out of poverty and helped relieve more physical problems than just about any economic system that humankind has ever attempted. But what we see here is not an attempt by the apostle to describe a macroeconomic system to be employed by a government and applied across the board. But what we see here is simply a practice of generosity that existed among the people of God. And what they were doing is not, it's a voluntary redistribution of their wealth. It is not, that was based on love and not based on coercion or not based on commandment. It's not based on something being forced upon people, which only hardens people's hearts. But rather it is people being melted by the love of Christ. Their hearts being softened and releasing people from the grip of the bondage of selfishness in order to show lavish sacrificial generosity to one another. And that's the kind of thing that happens when a group of people consistently bond themselves together in the bonds of affection in Christ, where they genuinely learn to love and to know one another, to recognize one another's needs, to care for one another deeply. There will be that kind of radical generosity. And I want to encourage us all to continue to be generous this winter because, number one, it helps other people. That's a good reason to be generous. Perhaps the first reason, it helps other people. And number two, because it is the number one weapon that God gives us, the true and living God, to keep the false god Mammon from devouring and dominating our lives. And so generosity was a marked characteristic of this community. And then fourthly, we see that continual hospitality, fellowship, sharing of meals, sharing of life, resulting in an overflow of glory and joy and praise. In other words, most of what happened within this community didn't happen in their corporate gatherings. As vital and important as those were, much of the things that are being described by Luke are things that happened in each other's homes, each other's places of dwelling, with a handful of brothers and sisters gathered together for mutual encouragement. It strikes me that the passages in Romans 13 and 1 Corinthians 13 that talk about the spiritual gifts that God distributes among His people, most of those are gifts that are not easily, if even at all, able to be manifested within a large corporate assembly, but are readily practiced within the context of a few people gathered together in their home. And so devote ourselves to this kind of hospitality, this sort of fellowship and sharing of life and food with one another. Now, if we do these things, that's how we get through winter. We do it by embracing the reality that winter is tough, but by coming together as God's people, we can not only survive it, but we will thrive as we come through the other side. Now, the core principle that makes all of this kind of community that's described by Luke here possible is a word that he gives us at the beginning of the passage, and that's the word devoted. This is the heart of the matter, and it speaks to the intensity and the frequency of their commitment to each other. And everything that we've described as we've worked through this passage depends upon that particular word. They devoted themselves to these things. You know, we're really good about studying things to discern the truth of the matter, to be able to identify with precision what the actual New Testament practice was. And that's great. But it is not adequate. It is not enough to know the truth of what the New Testament church believed and practiced. Absolutely not enough. That truth must be realized. It must be implemented. It must be put into practice. It must become a living reality in the present, not merely an artifact of knowledge about the past. And so that requires the difference between knowing what happened in the past and experiencing it in the present is that word devotion. It's the distance between the head and the heart of putting it into practice. So here are the takeaway things for us to remember. This winter, you don't even have to make a commitment to this for the next year or 5 years or 10 years or the rest of your life. I'm just challenging you for the rest of the winter. And I know winter doesn't officially begin for another few weeks, but it felt like winter to me when I walked outside today. So to get through winter, just commit to these things just for the next few weeks and see what happens. My belief is that if we will commit ourselves to these things fervently in the manner that we see described here, that when we get to the end of those 3 months, we're not going to want to stop. But make this commitment. Come to church every time you can. I know you expected the preacher to say that, but I really mean it. Come to church every time you get the chance. And I know it requires some sacrifice. You got to get up earlier than you want on your day off. You got to get the kids bathed and ready. And you got to make the trip down here. And it takes, 3 hours to spend here. Look, make a commitment to that. And not just because you're committed to going to church, but because you're committing yourselves to a group of people. Look around you, really, look around you right now. And see the faces. I wish you could sit where I'm sitting. Not many of you are looking around, but I'm looking for you. And I'm seeing amazing faces, people that I am so glad to see. And every week we get the opportunity to come here and look in one another's faces, to express words of encouragement to each other, to sing praises to God together, to be together, to gather around the Lord's table, to come together in prayer and offer up our praise, our needs, our solicitations to God for the things that we stand in need of. All of these are wonderful opportunities for us to grow and to be enriched. And so come to every service you can. Be here for all 3 phases on Sunday morning. Come again on Wednesday night and lean into it. Don't just come, but come with the determination that I'm coming to give my best to God and to other people. I'm going to find somebody to say something positive to, something encouraging to. I might find somebody that looks a little bit down, and I might even ask them, hey, let's step aside over here and let's just pray together. Lean into the opportunities that God gives us to form the kind of community that we all long for and that we see so richly described here. And when we do that, we should expect to see God move. And over time, to experience dynamic growth and to have God's shield of protection over us and over our family, and to gain insight into wisdom of God's will and His ways. Secondly, give consistently and sacrificially. And I don't say that for personal benefit. I say that to myself as well as to everyone here. Continue to give consistently and sacrificially. And here's why, for what I said before, because it helps people. We're going to have a statement to make at the end of the service that will, I think, illustrate that point well. But giving helps people. Your giving helps people. And it is God's weapon wielded in your heart to protect you from succumbing to the grip, the icy grip of the God Mammon. The God Mammon will surround you. He's a life-sucking God, and he will surround you with all kinds of cozy stuff, but leave your heart as cold as a stone. And by consistently giving for the good of others, we can keep Mammon at bay. And then thirdly, practice hospitality. Come together here in our assemblies every time you get the chance. Give generously, and then open up your home, open up your hearts to one another. You can do this in a wide variety of ways. The ladies here are all the time having showers for other women or getting married or having babies and things of that sort. Attend those. Be a part of that. Come to group meetings. Bring your children to the devotionals. Have people over for dinner. Ask someone out for coffee. Get to know people who are new so that we can know each other as well as possible and serve one another. Winter is hard. It's long, it's cold, it's dark. But together We're not just going to survive, but we're going to thrive. And so, with those things in mind, let's go to God in prayer once more as we conclude. Father God, what an awesome privilege it is to be called your children and to have the hope of glory resting within us. Father, to be a part of a unified body of people, a threefold cord that is not quickly broken, that is able to keep one another warm and cherished through the long, dark days of winter. Help us not to take this for granted, but help us to lean in, to push forward, and to draw closer to the ideal that we see given to us by your servant Luke here in Acts chapter 2. May the description of the lukewarm church of America as it is today be driven far from us, that we might have fervent hearts that are devoted to you and to one another. And we ask this blessing in the name of the one who is totally devoted to us, the Lord Jesus Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen. If you're not a Christian this morning, we want to extend that invitation to you to become a child of God and to participate in all of the blessings that Jesus came to secure for his people. If you've never put him on in baptism as a result of confessing your faith in him and turning from your ways to his, then we invite you to come this morning while we stand and sing to encourage.